The title of my paper is going to be Accuta, Aayar ere, Amarar ere. And normally it would be translated as, O Accuta, the lion among herdsmen, and the hoist. The hoist na the air in the karnil vayalla use pandra and the air. Tannir erekkara and the air. The hoist to immortality. And I would be giving some textual glimpses on prapatti on this topic. Now, before I begin, I would like to say a few words about the title of my paper. Periyazhvar in his Periya Thirumozhi, Pasuram 10, that is in Nankam Pattu Pattam Thirumozhi, Pasuram 10, he describes the Lord as Accuta, Aayar ere. That means a lion among the herdsmen. And Tondaradi Periyazhvar, in his Thirumalai Pasuram 2, he addresses the Lord as Accuta, Amarar ere. That would mean, O Accuta, O hoist for the immortals or hoist for immortality. In Sanskrit, we have the particle eva. It can be used either to stress on a regulation, or it can be used as a determinant indeclinable. In the Sanskrit, in grammar they say, evakaraha kimartaha niyamartaha, if it is going to be for a regulation, or when it is a determinant indeclinable, it is eva iti avadharane. Similarly, we have this particle tan in Tamil also, avandan sonnan, avandan seiya vendum. So when we say avandan seiya vendum, it becomes a regulation. When we say avandan sonnan, it becomes a determinant indeclinable. But here I would like to add another interpretation. In when we see it in relation to this Aayar ere, I would like to combine these both and say Accuta, Aayar ere, Amarar ere, and say, O Accuta, who is a lion among the herdsmen, you are the same who is the hoist for immortality. And my paper focuses on this Visishtadvaita perspective of the symbiotic relationship between the Lord and the devotee, especially from the perspective of surrender. And here we would see the name Accuta is used synonymously with the name Narayana, the Supreme One. And any Vedic ritual, it begins with the 12 names of the Lords, beginning with Accuta. I shall not go into all the 12 names because most of the Sri Vaishnava, all the Sri Vaishnavas are aware of it, of the 12 names, which is part and parcel of their everyday rendering. In the Agni Purana, it reduces these three into three simple names as Om Achyutaya Namaha, Om Anantaya Namaha, Om Govindaya Namaha. Whether we recite all the 12 names or only these three names, we see the first one that is uttered is Achyuta. Now, from some glimpses from Swami Deshika's Devanayaka Panchashata and Navamani Malai, Nammalvar's Thiruvaimozhi, Tondaradi Periyazhvar's Thirumalai, and Periyazhvar's Periya Thirumozhi, I am making an attempt to see how this name Achyuta, it stands for the symbiotic affinity in the Rakshya Rakshaka Sambandha, in the relationship of the redeemable and the redeemer, especially in the context of prapatti. Now, why is the Lord known as Achyuta? In the we have several texts which explain this Vyutpatti of Achyuta, and most famously in the Vishnu Sahasranama we come across his name Achyuta at least thrice, that is in verses 11, 35 and 72. There we have Ajaha Sarveshwara Siddha Siddhi Sarvadi Achyutaha And Achyutah Prathitah Prano Pranado Vasavanujaha Veda Swango Jata Krishno Drada Sankarshano Chutaha. In all these three instances, we come across his name Achyuta. And what we see is the three main acharyas representing the three schools of Vedanta have given their Vigraha Vakyas for this Achyuta in different manners. I am not going to go into the details because we are quite short of time. But from what all these acharyas explain of these names in all these three different contexts, they give three contextual explanations for that name, Achyuta. In the context of Prapatti, we can see that this name Achyuta means the one who is never let down by the devotees to slip away. And this Achyuta is one who never loses hold on his true devotees. And in this light, we shall have a few glimpses from all these texts that I mentioned earlier. First, Swami Deshika's Devanayaka Panchashat. Swami Deshika of the 13th to 14th century, he took Prapatti at the feet of Lord Devanayaka at Thiruvaindrapuram. At the end of his Devanayaka Panchashat, which is a hymn of 53 verses, Swami Deshika brings out the glory of Prapatti and of the devotee who has surrendered to the Lord, that is one who is a Prapanna. And there in verse 47, Swami Deshika acknowledges and accepts that both Bhakti Yoga and Prapatti are effective and are advised as means, upayas, to attain liberation. But he says, yet those who have the special mental strength, he uses the word Shakti, and the Gnana to understand the meditations enumerated in the Sadvidya and Dahara Vidya of the Chandogya Upanishad are fortunate to practice Bhakti Yoga to gain moksha. We heard Professor Clooney talking about the Nitya Grantha, and in that context he was saying how these meditations are being insisted upon not only in the Nitya Grantha but also in the Gita Bhashya and the Sri Bhashya and the Vedartha Sangraha in different manners, and they have to be practiced every day. And here we see Deshika is going to have a different take about meditations. When we talk about Nitya Grantha, I would like to say that Professor Clooney's translation of the Nitya Grantha is if not the authentic one, but one of the most authentic translations that we can benefit from. And I am very happy to say that the Adyar Library and Research Center was the first one, almost the first one, to publish an article when it was in the making stages, when Nitya Grantha was in the making stages. We were the first one to carry out an article by Professor Clooney on Nitya Grantha, which brought out all those translations that he was going to bring into that text. And continuing here on Bhakti Yoga, now Swami Deshika, he says in the same verse 47, if the glories of a Bhakti Yogin and a Prapanna were to be compared, suppose I compare the greatness of a Bhakti Yogin and the greatness of a Prapanna, the total glories of an assembly of Bhakti Yogins will be no match for 1 part in 100 crores of the glory of a Prapanna. That means here he is saying a Prapanna is greater than a mere Bhakti Yogin. Now here in the Devanayaka Panchashat, when we continue that on Prapatti, the Upanishads, they designate this ultimate reality as Brahman, and they have different descriptions of this Brahman as Satyam Jnanam Anantam Brahma in Taittiriya Upanishad, or Satyasa Satyam in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, or Tasya Hava Etasya Brahmano Nama Satyamiti in Chandogya Upanishad. And this Brahman is defined as the Adyar, origin, from which this entire universe and all beings, they proceed by saying Janma Dasya Yathaha in Brahma Sutra 112. And when we come to Navamani Male of Swami Deshika, in verse 8, he says, மஞ்சுளாவு சோலை சூழைந்தை மண்ணு சீர் வரையெடுத்து நிறையளித்த மாசில் வாசுதேவனே செஞ்சொல் அன்பர் சிந்தை கொண்டு தீதிலாத தூதனாய் தேருமூர்ந்து தேசுயர்ந்த செல்வம் தெய்வநாயக வெண்சொலாளர் கால தூதர் வீசு பாசம் வந்தன் மேல் விழுந்தெழுந்து யான் அயர்ந்து வீழ்வதற்கு முன்னணி அஞ்சல் 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 என்று அளிக்க வேண்டும் அச்சுதா அடியவர்க்கும் அருளியக்கும் அடியவர்க்கும் மெய்யனே. This last line is what I am going to concentrate upon or focus upon. Adiyavarkum aruliyakkum adiyavarkum meyyene in Navamani Malai 8. I am not going to give a translation because I am only going to concentrate on the last one. The last line is normally understood as, O Lord, who drives away this Ajnana, the nescience of your devotees. Adiyavarku marul iyakkum. That and Adiyavarku Meyyan, one who is true to his devotees. But here, I would like to bring in another interpretation. This is the way I look at it, that there can be a possibility of another interpretation. And I would like to read it as Adiyavarkum Aruliyakkum Adiyavarku Meyyane. Adiyavarkum Aruliyakkum. That is one who is true to those devotees who lovingly and humbly serve even your devotees. And therefore, here I see that the first interpretation by saying Adiyavarku Marul Iyakkum, it refers to the beneficiaries, the direct beneficiaries of the Lord's grace. That is, those who are doing Bhagavad Seva, like say Garuda or Hanuman and so on. And if I say Adiyavarkum Aruliyakkum, then it takes me further to those who serve the God's servants. That is, it takes them to Bhagavad Seva. And the greatest example would be Thiruvarangathu Amudanar, who was serving Bhagavad Ramanuja. And his verses of Ramanuja Nutrandadi are much in like Periyalvar's extolling the Lord in his Tirupalland. Now, when we talk about Prapatti, we said there is the Rakshya Rakshaka Sambandha, the relation between the redeemable and the redeemer. That means if I use the word redeemable, Rakshya, that means there has to be some eligibility for a devotee to be eligible to be redeemed. And we shall see how in the Nalayira Divya Prabandham, Nammalvar and Tondaradi Podiyalvar, they show what qualifies a devotee as fit to be redeemable by the Lord. Much was talked about by the earlier speakers on all those qualities which are necessary in a devotee to be redeemable. But here I will be taking these samples which make things much easier than what is said in all those. Now, in Nalayira Divya Prabandham, Nammalvar Thiruvaimozhi, Pasuram 3067, it says, Teernda Adiyavar Thammai Thirutti Panikolla Valla Aarnda Pugal Acchudanai Amarar ere Emmanai Vainda Valavayal Sul Tanvalang Kurugur Sadagopan Near the or Ayirthi Patum Marvene Tir Seime, that is given. But what I am concentrating on, Teernda Adiyavar Thammai Thirutti Panikolla Valla. This is what is important. That is what I am going to concentrate on. What makes a devotee fit for redemption. This verse, it brings forth an important characteristic, rather a condition for a devotee to be accepted as a prapanna by the Lord. It shows that mere devotion is not sufficient. The devotee who aspires for and he undertakes prapatti must never lose sight of his or her being a liege to the Lord. Moreover, that liege must have the salvific knowledge, that is the Gnanam, that the Lord is both the means and the end for salvation. And how may a devotee find this help in achieving this is indicated by the Nammalvar himself in his Thiruvaimozhi 5:2-9. And there he says, Mevi Tozhum Adyarum Bhagavarum Mikkadu Ulage. He is indicating there in the Nalayana Divya Prabandham 3360. There he says, may all attain liberation by worshipping him with no other expectation. Don't have any expectation. And how may you find your help in this, in achieving this? The world is full of holy persons, Bhagavargal, and the Lord's servants who, with no other expectation, worship that Accuta, with the Veda sanctified Rik in their speech, and with other forms of worship. Now, Nammalvar says hereby that the devotee must worship the Lord with no expectation other than his grace to be liberated. And he points out that this help is available through these holy persons. And here the term holy persons, they refer to those who are focused on the virtues of the Lord. That is, these like Bharata, who are focused on the virtues. They are Bhagavad Gunanishtas. And the term, the Lord's servants, they are also available in this world. It would mean those who are focused on the service to the Lord. They are Kainkaryanishtas, like Lakshmana. And when we say these holy persons, they also refer to renunciates and acharyas who hold the three-pronged staff. And this is what Professor Venkatakrishnan writes in his web blog on this verse. And as far as the word Adyar means, it can also refer to the householders. Now, when we come to this whole thing of Thiruvaimozhi 5:2-9 that I am discussing, Accuta means the Lord of all, who never lets go. This is what we started with, as all the Acharyas is talking about. Now, the term Accuta in the phrase worship that Accuta with the Veda sanctified Rik in their speech, it shows that even when a person worships that Lord with mere words, the Lord does not let go of that kind of worshipper. And where and one more word he uses is Gnana Vidhi Padayame. There it means the ordinance of knowledge. He says worship should be done without deviating from knowledge. That is, it should be according to the ordinance of knowledge. And that refers to the path of devotion prompted by knowledge, which I said that Gnana Visishta Bhakti. And again, when we say Gnana Vidhi Padayame, without deviating, without erring from, it implies doing unfailingly all those acts driven by that devotion. Thereby, the term knowledge in this context, it signifies a very unique, a conditioned devotion. It is qualified by knowledge as Gnana Visishta Bhakti. And that a devotee may get help from holy persons, it was suggested by Nammalvar. And that holy person can be the Lord himself, is suggested on, and he may be amidst us, is suggested explicitly by Periyalvar in his Periyatharumozhi 4:10-10. And this verse by Periyalvar says that the Lord of Shri is present as Archavatara Lord Ranganatha at Sri Ranga. And the same Lord was available to the gods as a savior while he was slaying the demon Madhu, or as well as the same Lord was available amongst the cowherds also as one among them. And this indicates that the Lord is never physically away from those who are dear to him. Thus, in the case of Prapati also, where the Lord is both the means and the end, he is never away from the true devotee, Mayyanbar. And the true devotee too never deviates from the thought of the Lord and his will for him, for her, with nothing else to accomplish, with no expectations whatsoever. The devotee continues to serve the Lord with the sense that the Lord is his or her refuge forever. And this is expressed by Thondaradi Podiyalvar in Tirumale verse 2, when he talks about Accuta, Amarar ere. And here in this verse, நாலாயிரதி பிரபதம் பாசுரம் 873 by தொண்டரடி பொடி ஆழ்வார் திருமாலை 2, it is very clear. He says, இச்சுவை தவிர நான் போய் இந்திர லோகம் காணும் அச்சுவை பெரினும் வேண்டேன் அரங்கமா நகருள்ளானே, because that is what he wants. He says, even that great, oh Accuta, and there he says, Accuta, Amarar ere. He says, oh Lord, who is the hoist for the immortals, even if I were to get the great world, to rule the great world of the Indras, I will not want that. Let me remain here. And this verse shows that two things are indicated by this. Liberation for a Sri Vaishnavite is a post-death condition. In Advaitha, we say liberation is available then and there, the moment you realize that you are Brahman. But here it is very clear that it is a post-death condition, and where he or she arises to Vaikunta, remains close to the Lord, and is blessed to perform eternal Kainkarya to the Lord. And this verse shows that a true devotee, a Mayanvan, who has imbibed the salvific knowledge, he understands the Lord is manifest everywhere, in everything. Everywhere is Sarvavyapi, in everything is Antaryaman, and as everything, as the Murta Murta. And even lordship over the higher worlds has no attraction for such a devotee. He is contented to remain in this world and continue to serve the Lord in whichever way is possible. And Kulasekara Alvar, he echoes this sentiment in his Perumal Tirumozhi when he says he desires to be reborn in the Tiruvengada hill, either as a stone on the steps on which the devotees walk up to have a darshan of the Lord, maybe a bird, a tree or a stream, or any other form in the forest or the hill, so that he can always be in the vicinity of the Lord and serve the Lord. Now let me come to my conclusion with a few glimpses of Swami Deshikan's Devanayaka Panchashat and from the Alvar's Pasurams. It brings to mind what the Lord promises us in the Bhagavad Gita, Charama Shloka. Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam saranam braja aham tva sarva papebhyo mokshayishyami mashucha. And we saw that the Lord's name Achyuta, in Sanskrit we write it as Achyuta, whereas Alvars in a Tamil thing we write Achyuta, it's the same. It stands for the symbiotic affinity in this Rakshya Rakshaka Sambandha between the devotee and the Lord. The devotee is Rakshya and the Lord is Rakshaka. The virtues of the Lord as Rakshaka, the unfailing Redeemer Achyuta, was seen in the light of Vedanta Deshika's Devanayaka Panchashata. An idea of Vedanta Deshika stand on the priority of Prapatti over Bhakti Yoga was seen while he was discussing his recommendation in his Devanayaka Panchashata. It does not mean that Bhakti is not necessary. It only means that mere Bhakti is not sufficient. You should have an unconditional surrender also to the Lord. And Vedanta Deshika saying in the Navamani Malai that the Lord is ever willing to come to the rescue of the helpless and those who surrender to Him indicates that there must be an unequivocal intention in the devotee to take to the path of Prapatti. And Nammalvar and Tondaradi Podiyalvar, they show what qualifies a devotee to be redeemable. And Nammalvar's Thiruvaimozhi, it emphasizes that the devotee who aspires for and undertakes Prapatti must never lose sight of his or her being a leash to the Lord, and he must have the salvific knowledge that the Lord is both the Upaya and Upeya of salvation. And Nammalvar says that help for those such sincere devotees is available in the form of holy persons and the servants of God. But all the actions of the devotees must be driven by devotion qualified by knowledge. That is, everything must be Gnana Visishta Bhakti. And there is a symbiotic association of the Rakshya and the Rakshaka in Prapatti. And the Lord, denoted by the name Achyuta, neither lets go his hold on the devotee, nor does the devotee let go his hold on the Lord. And for this, the Lord himself extends all the support that the devotee needs. When it is said that a devotee may get help from holy persons, that holy person can be the Lord himself, and this is mentioned explicitly by Periyalvar in Periya Thirumozhi. And he who is praised as both the means for reaching Vaikuntha may very well be mingling among the cowherds. That means he can be very well among us also. Thus, the name Achyuta, it stands for the symbiotic affinity in the Rakshya Rakshaka Sambandha, especially in the process and success of Prakriti. And therefore, when we say Achyuta, Aayar ere, Amarar ere, it means both. O Achyuta, the lion among herdsmen, and the hoist to immortality. It is my plea, my request to the Lord to come and help me. And it can also be a lesson to me, a reminder to me. O Achyuta, the lion among herdsmen is the same as the hoist to immortality. And that is a reminder and that we can derive here. And if I have a minute or so, I would like to add two words here. One is today, in today's Times of India speaking tree, I read about the 18 guidelines, Sri Ramanujar's guidelines to what a devotee should be by Professor C.T. Indra. That has come out in today's speaking tree of the Times of India. Those of you who are interested can read to those 18 guidelines, and she connects it with those 18 times that he visited Trikoshti. And there is one postscript that goes along with what I have been trying to talk about. I quoted the example of Hanuman, and I read this again in the speaking tree on Friday, that there can be no slippage whatsoever for one who is acting in accordance with the Lord's will. And this piece is by Uma Ram and K.S. Ram on the titled, How Come His Loincloth Did Not Slip? This is about Hanuman. I'll quote only excerpts from that whole article. The question relates to Hanuman. The context relates to his leaping across the ocean on a mission to gather intelligence regarding Sita, kidnapped by Ravana and held in Lanka. The questioner is none other than Sarvagnya, the 16th century Kannada mendicant poet. One of his epigrams, one of the poet's epigrams reads as follows. Crossing the sea, Raghav's yeoman, leaping to the golden city, yet wonder, his loincloth never slipped. Sarvagnya. Hanuman had taken the aerial route to cross the sea. He did so not in the safety of a closed plain, but in full exposure to wind pressure. And he had to contend with an ogress on the way. Never once in all this did his loincloth slip. One can extend the wonder to include other flights of Hanuman when he flew to the Himalayas to fetch the miracle herb Sanjeevani, and when he fought aerial duels with Ravana's son Indrajit and other Lankan warlords. Hanuman's loincloth, let's recall, was not secured by any modern day pins or hooks or zippers, and yet it stayed in place. The key word in the epigram is yeoman. Hanuman did all that he did, not as an independent individual, but as Raghav's yeoman. He had surrendered his will to Raghav. When you make yourself a mere instrument of God, acting in accordance with his will to his greater glory, there is no chance of failure in your mission. There can be no slippages, major or minor. Your loincloth holds securely. Thank you.
I would like first to thank Professor Raghunathan for this excellent paper. As with Professor Pannier-Selvan's paper, we look forward to the book coming out so that you can read the full paper that's so beautiful and there's so many things to talk about. We are certainly eager to go for lunch, so I will be very brief in my comment as chair on the two papers. To remember, first of all, that our point is to honor Sri Ramanuja, but also to put him in spiritual, intellectual contexts, to see him as a living intellectual figure who can be analyzed and talked about from different angles. And I appreciate the fact that both papers did this in their own way. Professor Pannier-Selvam, in his brilliant paper, I think showed us that we need to be able to take the philosophical Ramanuja utterly seriously as a philosophical figure. So one interpretation of what I was saying in my opening remarks was that seeing the spiritual helps us to understand the philosophical. But I think it's very clear that from what Professor is saying, the philosophical is not merely an appendage to the spiritual, but it's substantive and important in itself. And the very dense analysis in the paper of the nature of consciousness, the nature of consciousness in relationship to intentionality, and then how, contrasting Shankara and Ramanuja, the nature of consciousness in relationship to the, you might call the transcendent and the empirical. And I think this is very well pointed out because it shows that there are substantive philosophical issues at stake about consciousness, the subject-object relationship of consciousness, and what consciousness tells us not only about the transcendent, but also about life and understanding of the human being in this world. And I think that's really important, and therefore I think Professor has brought to life why is this argument between Ramanuja school and Shankara school important? Because it's about the very nature of who we are, and showing that the substantive issues can be dealt with. Once that has been done, and I'm going very briefly, showing the substantive nature allows for comparison with Edmund Husserl, the great phenomenologist in the West. And again, not simply as lip service, to say, well, you have great philosophers and we have great philosophers. I can use the word phenomenology with both. That would be only a mere starting point. And I think what Professor has done brilliantly is to show that substantively, philosophically, rationally, Ramanuja and Husserl should be in conversation because they're dealing with the same problems of consciousness and intentionality. And this I've tried in my own work with theologians, but I think you do it very nicely in your paper, is that anyone who's interested in phenomenology would do well to be reading both Husserl and Ramanuja. And there's so many Husserl scholars in the West would be very well advised to take seriously the thinking of Ramanuja. And that this is not simply, again, honoring the East or honoring India, but rather for philosophical reasons this is to be done. Had we time to talk, I would ask Professor, and we can talk at lunch maybe, what do Husserl scholars have to learn from Ramanuja that they do not know from Husserl alone? So what's the payoff for a Husserl scholar to bother reading Ramanuja? And then secondly, in terms of what I was saying, both Ramanuja and Husserl could be taken simply as intellectuals, but how important is it then to understand the spiritual consciousness of Husserl and to see him also as a spiritual figure with spiritual motivation? So those are just questions for follow-up. And then Professor Raghunathan's paper, I think, again shows us what our Acharya was saying earlier, that these figures like Ramanuja do not think in a vacuum. They do not think simply in their isolated space, as if they are ivory tower figures alone, thinking by themselves, but there's an ongoing conversation. And I think when you read her paper, you will see the brilliant kind of back and forth between Ramanuja, and then Deshika, and then the Alvars, and then the Vishnu Sahasranama, and commentaries on Vishnu Sahasranama. And for some people it can at first be daunting and overly challenging to say, how can you think about all of this at once? And yet I think she shows us in her paper that you should think about all of this together. And that reading Sahasranama by itself, reciting it by itself is very wonderful. But understanding it intellectually in terms of what those names mean gets you into reading Ramanuja, Deshika, and also paying attention to other acharyas. So I think opening that up and showing it is extremely important. And again, a difference comes to the fore. So as you say in your paper, what does Shankara think Accuta means? The one who has no change, because he does not undergo the 6 modifications: existence, birth, growth, modification, degeneration, and death. So it is this kind of perfection of the nature of the divine person, who has none of these failings, none of these vikaras, and so on like that. And yet you show us, I think, brilliantly that in Ramanuja, the word Accuta is related immediately to the needs of the devotees. The Rakshaka relationship, The idea that unfallenness in some transcendent sense by itself is not enough, because there is the empirical need for the Accuta be related to people in times of trouble. So the Lord is unfailing, unfallen, never deviating in determination to be protecting those who need to be protected. And this is not incompatible with what Shankara is saying. You can have both levels. But the idea that there is this force here, the name Accuta shows us the spiritual meaning as well as the intellectual meaning, I think is so important. And that how that then relates to the meaning of prapatti. That prapatti is possible, prapatti makes good sense intellectually and spiritually because the Lord is Accuta. And if the Lord was not, if the Lord was unreliable or uncaring, then prapatti would have less power. So I'll have to stop there because we are running short on time. But to say that both papers in their own way open up much wider discussions. And I guess the last thing I would say regarding Professor Raghunathan's paper is that just as Professor takes up Ramanuja and Husserl, you could begin to read some Western thinker, someone, St. Bonaventure, St. Anselm, how the devotional language has solid grounding in philosophy, and show some kind of back and forth, just as Professor did. That's like the next stage in your even longer paper. So, thank you both.
I now request Krishnameni to honor the speaker, Dr. Radha Raghunathan.